my thunder, which I'm very, very pleased.
So, Ed Levy, transit historian and planner.
Anybody who wants to read my book should first start out reading the subtitle, because that's the book. Plans, Projects, Politics, and Paralysis. And we are sure in the last stage of it now. This is basically a history of rapid transit, of transit in general, but mostly rapid transit. So I'll go over the historical parts fairly quickly, because the last question that was just asked by Peter Myazak is my own raison d'etre, actually, for the future of the U-shaped line that doesn't necessarily have to be a continuous subway operation, but has been talked about for the last 100 years at least. Back in 1910, one Horatio Hockin ran for mayor on the platform of Tubes for the People. At that time, Boston had just opened the first subway in North America, the present Green Line, for those of you familiar with Boston. Still running, still carrying millions of people. And Budapest and a few other major cities in the world. And Toronto, with a grand total population of 350,000 at the time. It was called the Hopeful City for a variety of reasons, and he felt that it needed to join the ranks, and that was his dream. And unfortunately, he lost the election. There was a lot of support for this in the city, but he lost the election, and the next mayor, Mr. Geary, for whom a very small, obscure street, deservedly small, in the west end of the city, was very much against it. It reminds me of somebody we all know. That was the end of that idea. But not to be daunted, the city engaged a major firm of transit consultants, civil engineering consultants from New York City, Jacobs and Davies. They did the first major, well-documented, big, thick document report on rapid transit for the city of Toronto. And this is a very familiar looking map. You can see the Yonge Street line, which has always been job one, deservedly so. And you can see what looks a hell of a lot like the downtown relief line, or the regional relief line. In pure irony, the only part of this that ever got built is that dotted red line at the top, which is the St. Clair LRT, or at-grade streetcar system, which everybody loves to hate. But that's there, and the rest of the line has never been completed, never even been started. It ran down Broadview, through the downtown, past the Union Station, both old and new, and by a zigzag pattern, which was rather impractical, but anyway, it finally reached St. Clair near Weston Road. And that was their preferred scheme. There are actually many schemes in this report. It's quite a fascinating document. The following year, this very amateurish drawing appeared in the Toronto Telegram. None of you in this room are old enough to remember that except me. Oh, please. And I don't know how this map ever made it into the public press in a major city, but there it is. And it showed, again, they called it the Tiroli Tube. Tiroli was the name of Bay Street, north of Queen. They were two separate streets at that time. And they wanted to make sure that the major commercial street, Yonge Street, was not disturbed by subway construction, and also one William Mackenzie ran the privately owned streetcar franchise at the time, and there would have been an endless series of lawsuits if somebody had tried to build a subway under his most profitable streetcar line on Yonge Street. But it's still the same north-south line. And then there was plans for later what they call subways on Bloor Danforth across the viaduct that was now then being planned at Bloor between Broadview and Castle Frank, and on Queen Street. Queen actually and parts of Richmond Street. This lasted for also barely a year, and then A consultant from Chicago was hired, one Brian J. Arnold, who was a very eminent electrical consulting engineer who actually worked on the Grand Central Terminal electrification with William Wilgus. And he also recommended a possibility of a subway on Yonge Street south from St. Clair, into which a whole family of streetcar lines built in the annexed area, the newly annexed areas of the city to the north, would feed and therefore compete with Mackenzie's franchise. Again, it was rather impractical because it showed it going directly under Yonge Street, and it didn't even reach Union Station. It stopped at a loop around Temperance and Adelaide Street. So this was, and then of course it's the first instance of a fairly responsible plan for a streetcar system that ran across the bridge, across the viaduct, and that's exactly the way that viaduct was ultimately built, the Prince Edward Viaduct. This is what Yonge Street would have looked like. I don't think it would have even been possible to build this, and legally, as I said before, they would have been held to pay. So this also never got built. I particularly like the pattern of new streetcar lines in the annexed area. There are two lines there that run right through Forest Hill Village. If any of you know Forest Hill Village, I can just imagine what the good burgers of today would have thought of that. It would have been long abandoned. But anyway, that's the way things were in those days. In 1915, almost every year a new plan came out, as you can see. And as you can also see, this was a plan that was completely different from anything that went before. There's no sign of lines on Queen or Bloor Danforth. This was done by the predecessor of GO Transit, the Ontario System of Radial Electric Railways, the last of which ended service to Richmond Hill in 1948. In the U.S., these are called interurban railways, and they were very, very heavily used throughout the eastern states, and Los Angeles had a very vast system. They competed with the steam railroads. This was a way of bringing those radial lines into the center of the city. Each one of them had to stop at the city limits, again because of the Mackenzie franchise. You had to transfer very awkwardly and pay an extra fare. This was a way of bringing in a line from the far north. That line going to the north up Yonge Street went as far as Lake Simcoe until 1930. The Metropolitan Radial Railway, the North Yonge Division, they ran out to West Hill along Kingston Road, and out to Port Credit along Lakeshore Road, and there were lines eventually reaching Guelph and Woodbridge and Weston and so on. You can see them all in red there. And the idea here was to bring the radial lines into the center of the city with that big red dot at the bottom, which was supposed to be a major freight and passenger terminal, roughly where Water Park Place is today. And of course, all of this never happened, and then Yonge Street was supposed to be the main trunk for the Northern Line. This was done by the famous Director of Public Works, R.C. Harris, he of the wonderful waterworks at the end of Queen Street, and the chairs of the Toronto Hydro. It was an electrified system, and the chair of the Harbor Commission, which was in the process of beginning to fill in the south of Front Street to the configuration we see today. This is the most, I'm a proud owner of one of the originals of this report. It is a superb work of art from 1915, it's nearly 100 years old, giant color sheets. I mean, I don't know what it's worth to the collecting agency, but until I leave this mortal coil, it's going to stay with me. This is really something to see. And all for naught, all for absolutely naught. This was at the beginning of the First World War, and things fell apart as far as major transit planning at that time. There was a 35-year hiatus where the love affair of the automobile during the 20s took over, followed by the Great Depression of the 30s, followed by the Second World War. And the TTC, as Chairman Ojimeri mentioned, was formed in 1921 at the end of the Mackenzie franchise. Their first job was to completely rebuild the streetcar network that he had allowed to be run into the ground, so to speak, and to buy a whole fleet of new Peterwitt tram cars. And some of you may well remember those great round-ended, heavy-duty workhorses of the fleet that lasted, and we still have a couple of them on the roster, I think, Chairman. They're stored at the car barns near the beach, and sometimes they're out on parade. And there's a few others at the wonderful Halton County Radio Museum near Guelph. As the war drew to a close, the Second World War, in 1942, the TTC came out with the last streetcar subway proposal. All of the early proposals really envisaged streetcars, single cars, maybe doubles, running in those tunnels. There was no thought of a conventional subway with multiple unit trains until later than this. This was the last gasp of the streetcar subway planning. Again, the Young Bay route is shown as the main trunk, and a line running on Queen and parts of Richmond and parts of Adelaide Street through the downtown, an east-west line, with surface connections. There was supposed to be an off-street line running right up the Don Valley on the present route of the Don Valley Parkway up to pick up the line on Danforth. There were also lines proposed for the Nordheimer Ravine. This one here is running on the right-of-way of the Spadina subway today, interestingly enough, and then one on the old Belt Line, again through Forest Hill and parts of Fairbank, and that is now a very, very much beloved walking and cycle path, so you can imagine, again, what my neighbors would think of that one. So that's connected in north of St. Clair near Davis Place. Very, very shortly thereafter, the famous Chairman O'Brien insisted that Toronto was now big enough and wealthy enough to think of a real subway, and this was the 1944 plan, which eventually, in terms of the Yonge Street line, finally got built, and this is the line we have today. This was a major turning point for the city. I can still remember clearly the absolute joy that was expressed by everybody in the city at that time. The crowds were vast. The line was overloaded on day one and has remained so ever since. It's capacity constrained if ever there was one. And it ran 4.5 miles, 7.4 kilometers from Union Station in the south to Eglinton. And it was a rather courageous thing to do, to take it as far as Eglinton. Eglinton was a very, very small byway at that time. I remember little single-family houses dotting the Young Eglinton intersection at that time, and a tired old Kresge store, or Woolworth store, whatever it is, where the Young Eglinton Center is. And again, as I say, it fed on several connecting bus and streetcar lines. The Queen Street subway was never completed. That was to start out as a streetcar subway. And all of you know about, I think all of you may know about the GO station, which was built under the Yonge Street line at Queen. It's still there, totally disused. I can see it as a nice little transit museum of some kind, because I don't think the Queen Street route is the appropriate route for the future, may we pray to God, relief line, because the centroid of activity in the center of the city has now moved south and west, as you know. So that's, and of course the Queen line was supposed to extend onto the surface system, as you can see by the dashed lines. And this is very much the pattern of what goes on in Boston with the Green Line, and in Newark had a streetcar subway which used to connect with its surface lines. This was a common thing to do. Within a very, very